Welcome to our chapter on data ethics. We're going to use some of the topics from your textbook and add some topics for this course. They're contained in this set of lecture notes. We're going to think about ethics in statistics and related studies from two main directions: from the viewpoint as the consumer of data and from the viewpoint as the reporter of the data, if you were running the analysis or if you were repeating the results of a study in a news media article or in a paper for your class. A consumer of data is when you hear something in the media and you have to choose whether to believe it, critically analyze it, and make a decision. How do we know if there's an ethics violation? There are many obvious ethics violations. Hopefully a lot are obvious to the general public: using deception, publishing fake data, leaving subjects out of the analysis because their results don't say what you want them to, and lots of other things. Other ethics violations are not so obvious and are the subject of debate. We need to have systems in place to define ethical violations and help avoid them. First, we're going to look at ethical guidelines according to the American Statistical Association, which is probably the largest and most well-known organization of statisticians in the world. We're going to look at articles from time to time as examples, and some of these come from their publication. On their webpage, you can see their ethical guidelines printed clearly: professionalism, responsibilities to funders, clients, and employers, responsibilities in publications and testimony, in research subjects, to research team colleagues, to other statisticians or statistical practitioners, regarding allegations of misconduct, and the responsibility of employers. It's pulling everyone together to try to make sure that the statistician can maintain a sense of integrity. Feel free to read these at your leisure in detail and visit the website to have expanded explanations. The ASA, or American Statistical Association, has worked very diligently to try to define some ethical parameters for the field of statistics. There are federal guidelines to protect human subjects in research. Federal law requires any research that is directly or indirectly supported by the Department of Health and Human Services to have an institutional review board. Note that we abbreviate Institutional Review Board as IRB quite often. The Institutional Review Board reviews all planned studies in advance to protect the subjects from possible harm, to protect subjects' rights and welfare. They do nothing else. They do not decide whether the study will produce valuable information, whether there are going to be lurking variables, whether they have a good design of experiment, whether it's going to go over budget. They do not do any of that. They are solely there to inspect the study, to protect the rights and welfare of the human subjects, to protect the subjects from possible harm. They must have at least 5 members, at least 1 scientist, 1 non-scientist, and 1 unaffiliated with the organization, and the members should be diverse in race, gender, and culture. Check out our university's Institutional Review Board. Our university's main page on the Office of the Vice President for Research, on research compliance, where we drill down to the Institutional Review Board, has the committee members listed right here. If we click on that link, it pulls up a file with the names of our Institutional Review Board members. Take a look at the names on the screen. Do you know any of these faculty? I'd be willing to bet some of you have them as your professors. Some guidelines that have been set include informed consent. Informed consent must be obtained before data are collected. The subjects must be informed in advance about any risk of harm, and the consent is usually in writing. All individual data must be kept confidential. We can report statistical summaries for groups of subjects in public. We can report them in journals, in the field that's being studied, in the news, in mainstream media. We can report summary statistics, but we can't report individual data. So confidentiality is one thing. Anonymity is slightly different. This is where the subjects' names are not known even to the director of the study. With anonymity, it's difficult to follow up with the patient later. Sometimes when we use anonymity, we give the patient a code. Let's say if they're getting a test done for a disease that they don't really want anyone to know if they do test positive for it. So sometimes we offer clinics with anonymity, where a person can come in and only be identified by a number, have their blood drawn to be tested for the disease, and then they could come back and only look up their results with their number, so no one ever has their name. This would be considered anonymity. Anonymity is not common in statistical studies, but sometimes it's necessary to balance the needs of the public against the needs of the researchers. Of course, there's a lot of research in medicine and in the public health arena. The World Medical Association was formed in 1947 to serve humanity by endeavoring to achieve the highest international standards in medical education, medical science, medical art, and medical ethics and health care for all people in the world. They developed the famous Declaration of Helsinki as a statement of ethical principles to provide guidance to physicians and other participants in medical research with human subjects. They state, in medical research involving human subjects, the well-being of the individual research subject must take precedence over all other interests. Because the well-being of subjects must come first, medical treatments can be tested in clinical trials only when there is reason to hope that they will help the patients who are the subjects in the trials. Future benefits alone are not enough to justify any experiment with human subjects. So how do we collect this valuable data in the medical arena? Clinical trials are experiments that study the effectiveness of medical treatments on actual patients. Clinical trials use randomized comparative experiments to study the effectiveness of newly proposed treatments or drugs, but can be risky. Taken from clinicaltrials.gov website, the phases of a clinical trial are 4 phases. Most of you have heard of only 3 phases of a clinical trial, but make sure you note that there are 4 phases. You need to know this for this class, and you'll be tested on the definition of the various different phases. Phase 1 has a very small sample size, and this is when we're testing out the experimental drug or treatment for the first time to evaluate its safety, try to determine a safe dosage range, and identify side effects. Phase 2, if it passes Phase 1, is given to a slightly larger group of people to see if it is effective and to further evaluate its safety. After Phase 2, you're ready to go into your very large Phase 3 trial. This is the trial right before the drug gets approved or disapproved by the FDA. This is the one that you report all your final results to from. This one's given to the largest group of people to confirm its effectiveness, monitor for side effects, compare it to commonly used treatments, and collect information that will allow the experimental drug or treatment to be used safely. After Phase 3, the drug is either approved or denied to go to market. If it goes to market, then you have a Phase 4 trial. Phase 4 trials are the post-marketing studies that delineate additional information including the drug's risks and benefits and optimal use. One would hope that after a drug has gone through all 3 phases, preliminary phases of a clinical trial, before they get approved to go to market, that it's safe to be marketed. However, in Phase 4 trials, quite often we are finding that drugs have serious side effects that were not discovered during the first 3 clinical trials. There's a push to require more stringent Phase 4 testing. Vioxx was a popular drug approved for the treatment of arthritis and had 8,076 patients in its enormous Phase 3 trials. Nevertheless, it wasn't powerful enough to reliably detect rare adverse events with a prevalence of 1 to 2% compared with placebo. Phase 4 trials allowed detection of these rare adverse events, and Vioxx was pulled from the market in 2004. In clinical trials, we like to do randomized controlled experiments, and oftentimes we're comparing a treatment group or several treatment groups to a placebo control. Placebo controls have long been debated in terms of ethics. There are arguments for and against them. Let's take a look at a recent controlled experiment and discuss some ethical debates that may arise. This New York Times article in 2010 outlines a very important debate in clinical trials. This has been the topic of many, many discussions at conferences among the medical community. It's titled New Drugs Stir Debate on Rules of Clinical Trials. If you take a look at the pictures of the two cousins here in the middle of the screen, the one on the left is Thomas McLaughlin, and the one on the right is Brandon Ryan. They both worked outside for a living and ended up both getting the same type of melanoma, which is a very lethal form of skin cancer. They both qualified for a promising new, hopefully breakthrough drug to treat this certain type of melanoma. Thomas McLaughlin got diagnosed first, and when he entered the trial, a computer lottery randomly allocated him to the actual treatment group. So he got the new drug, and he was getting better very rapidly. Long story short, a couple months later, when Brandon Ryan entered the trial, the computer lottery allocated him to the control group. The control group was the standard chemotherapy drug that is widely known not to work. He quickly progressed and got ill and passed away. Even when the whole family begged for him to get crossed over, when it was clear he wasn't going to get better on the chemotherapy, the clinical trial researchers wouldn't allow him to cross over to the new experimental drug lest he muddy the results. This has caused enormous debate because the chemotherapy in this case really was more of a placebo group. It was almost like getting nothing at all, since it was widely known that it wouldn't work. These sorts of debates will be ongoing, and so it's very, very important that we keep a dialogue going so we can try to do the best we can going forward. This is why we have review boards and ethics panels, so we can have a continuing discussion when situations such as this arise. Now, behavioral and social science experiments are a bit different than those found in the medical community. The direct risks are perceived as less acute in general, less physical harm, and maybe more psychological harm. The ethical principles of the American Psychological Association require consent unless a behavior is merely observed in a public place. The APA does allow deception if it's necessary to the study, does not hide information that may influence a subject's willingness to participate, and is explained to the subjects as soon as possible. Let's take a look at an example of a psychological experiment. Researchers conducting a personal space experiment set up shop in a public men's restroom. Urinals were blocked off to force men to use either a urinal next to an experimenter, which was considered the treatment, or a urinal away from the experimenter, which was considered a control. Another experimenter used a periscope from a stall to record the time it took to start urinating and the length of time urination occurred. Would this experiment be considered ethical according to the current standards of the APA? I don't think so anymore. Even though men, in general, are less likely to feel a violation of privacy in such an experiment, I would imagine, I don't think this would meet the ethical guidelines of the American Psychological Association today. Hopefully that was a good introduction to some principles of ethics in statistical studies.